Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're setting off on a really fascinating journey to discover how the modern concept of international peace actually came to be. We're going to trace its evolution from a completely abstract philosophical blueprint into a visceral, global cultural movement. It's literally the story of how ideas on a page transformed into a worldwide demand for change, fundamentally reshaping how we view war and diplomacy.
So it all starts with the ultimate question, doesn't it? Is perpetual peace actually possible, or is it just some utopian dream? Hooking into this central idea right out of the gate is absolutely crucial, because to understand how we got to our modern institutions, we have to look at the two essential halves of any major social change, the intellectual logic, which we'll call the head, and the emotional catalyst, the heart. We're going to look at the brilliant thinkers who mapped out the structure of peace and the passionate activists who made the world actually care about it.
Part 1. The State of War. Okay, let's dive into this. Before we look at peace, we have to understand the historical baseline. For much of human history, war wasn't considered a failure of politics. Actually, it was seen as the glorious, natural, default condition of independent states. The 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes famously argued that the state of nature is literally a war of all against all. Human nature, in his view, pretty much guarantees endless conflict, driven by competition and fear. But then, fast forward a bit, and we meet Immanuel Kant. Kant completely flips the script. He argues that while man might have a natural inclination toward conflict, peace is a moral duty. It's an idea of reason. Kant believed that peace isn't just going to magically happen. It's something that must be actively, deliberately built through law and structure.
Moving on to Part 2, Kant's blueprint per peace. That brings us to the head of our narrative, Immanuel Kant, and his groundbreaking 1795 theoretical essay, Perpetual Peace. Written during a time of immense European upheaval, this wasn't just some hopeful wish. It was a highly structured, logical architecture for international law. So the crucial point is how Kant planned to systematically dismantle the mechanics of war. His preliminary steps? No secret treaties that quietly plan for future conflicts. No buying or trading independent states like their pieces of property. The gradual abolition of standing armies, because keeping a massive military inherently threatens your neighbors. No using national debt to fund foreign conflicts, and absolutely no violent intervention in another state's inner-toward affairs. Kant basically wanted to cut off the funding and the very mechanisms that made war possible in the first place.
But it wasn't just about tearing down the old system. Once you remove the causes of war, Kant said, you have to build positive conditions to guarantee peace. First, states need representative, or what he called republican, constitutions, so the citizens who actually suffer in wars have a say in starting them. Second, these free states must form a federation, an international league binding them to a shared rule of law. And third, universal hospitality and commerce. Kant pragmatically realized that human self-interest is powerful. By tying nations together through global trade and mutual economic benefit, nature itself forces peace, simply because war becomes far too expensive and ruinous for business.
Part 3, Suttner's cultural earthquake.
Now we pivot to the heart of our explainer. Kant gave us the brilliant, but let's face it, incredibly dry and cold logical blueprint. It took an Austrian aristocrat nearly a century later to translate those concepts into a harrowing emotional appeal that everyday people could actually feel. In 1889, Bertha von Suttner published a fictional autobiography titled Die Waffen nieder, which translates to Lay Down Your Arms. It became an absolute sensation, a massive international bestseller. The novel tells the deeply personal, tragic story of Martha Althos, a Viennese noblewoman who loses two husbands to the relentless, completely senseless dynastic wars of the mid-19th century. Through Martha's eyes, the public wasn't reading academic philosophy. They were experiencing the agonizing grief of a shattered family.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core conflict of Suttner's novel. She directly contrasts the deeply ingrained myth of war with its horrifying reality. On one hand, you have Martha's father, a retired general who endlessly champions the glorious heroism, the patriotism, and the necessity of combat that gets taught in schools. But Martha's lived reality is vastly different. Suttner exposes a sheltered reading public to the raw, visceral horror of the battlefield, the devastating outbreaks of cholera, the ruined economies, and the lifelong grief of the widows and orphans left behind.
The impact of this book honestly cannot be overstated. Listen to this massive endorsement from the legendary Russian author Leo Tolstoy, who wrote directly to Suttner. He said, "The abolition of slavery was preceded by the famous book of a woman, Mrs. Beecher Stowe. May God grant that the abolition of war may follow yours." That quote instantly validates the historical weight of her novel. It wasn't just a sad story. It was a direct, targeted challenge to the entire military-industrial status quo of 19th century Europe.
Now, what's really interesting here is the concrete result of her work. Because of this specific book, her relentless activism, and her direct influence on powerful figures of her time, including Alfred Nobel himself, Bertha von Suttner achieved a monumental first. In 1905, she became the very first woman in history to win the Nobel Peace Prize. She didn't just write a book, she became the organizational powerhouse behind the early European peace movement.
Which brings us to part 4, a timeless anti-war legacy. Let's move to and see how this builds, because this is the final part of our journey. These aren't just dusty historical artifacts. These works actively laid the foundation for the international diplomacy and institutions we rely on today. Look at how rapidly this evolved once the ideas took hold. In 1795, Kant maps out the theory. In 1889, Suttner sparks the passion, making the world care deeply about it. And just 10 years later, in 1899, we see rapid real-world evolution. Inspired directly by the momentum generated by Suttner's text, the Tsar of Russia convened the First Hague Peace Conference. This was a monumental step toward establishing an actual, working international court of arbitration, which is exactly the kind of federation Kant had visualized a century earlier. But what is truly staggering is how relevant this remains today. When we look at modern readers who are discovering Suttner's 130-plus-year-old novel right now, the reaction is profound. One modern Goodreads reviewer noted, "I shall never again hear the utterance of defense budget without thinking of this book and shuddering." It highlights how her arguments against the manufacturing of consent for massive military spending still strike a really deep chord with contemporary audiences. Another reviewer pointed out something equally striking, stating, "The arguments used to start wars in 19th century Europe sound just like those used by modern politicians." And to be completely objective here, whether we are analyzing left-wing or right-wing governments today, across the globe, the cyclical justifications for military action, the language of preemptive defense, national honor, and unavoidable conflict, they mirror exactly the rhetoric that both Suttner and Kant dedicated their lives to dismantling. The script remains remarkably unchanged.
Which leaves us with this final, vital question to ponder. Have we truly evolved past the glorification of war, or are we still just waiting to lay down our arms? We have Kant's blueprint. We have Suttner's emotional rallying cry. The framework for peace is literally right there, but it is entirely up to us as individuals and as a society to decide if we're going to fully embrace it. I highly encourage you to explore these foundational texts for yourselves. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.